changed man began to formulate this burning desire to kill Joyce Yost.
She vanished. We all knew that it wasn't good.
Welcome to another live Q&A session with Dave Colley, the host of Cold. And I'm Becky Bruce, just your friendly digital content producer hanging out here in the background to ask the questions that you guys have passed along to me. Dave, I guess first of all, we should start with here there be spoilers.
Of course, as always.
We may talk about things that if you haven't listened to the episode, will spoil you for the episode. So let's dive in. This episode covers a lot of ground. One of the first things that struck me was right at the beginning when Joyce Yost's family realizes that she hasn't showed up for work, that they kind of have to wait a little while to report her missing, that the police basically want to know when 24 hours started and they don't know. Has anything changed with respect to reporting somebody missing in the time since Joyce disappeared?
You know, this is something that I found personally interesting in covering this part of the story, because there's nothing in the law that says you have to or even should wait a specified period of time before reporting somebody missing. But it's something that we hear a lot in popular media covering these kinds of cases where, I think it's almost a myth that police will ask you to wait 24 hours before they'll begin investigating a missing persons case. What we see happen with Joyce's case, though, is that clearly her daughter, Kim Salazar, recognizes right from that Monday morning that something is off. When she goes out to ask the police to begin looking into it, it's met by a little bit of hesitation on the part of the police at that time. And I think that is something of a reflection that back in the mid-'80s, an adult, especially a person not showing up for work, wasn't necessarily treated as a suspicious circumstance. It's a very different response. And part of what I find so interesting about it is we can compare and contrast with Susan Powell in season 1, right? Where that was a similar situation, didn't show up for work. And the concern at the time was that the family might be inside the house, that there could be carbon monoxide, and police in that case were very quick to go out to the house. The patrol officers who originally responded very quickly said, this is a situation that needs a detective assigned to come out and start looking into it because it's odd. Joyce had this history with Doug Lovell at the time, and clearly that was something that South Ogden police were aware of, that her family was making sure the police knew, if they were not familiar, that, hey, look, Joyce disappearing in the broader circumstances taking place here is a matter for huge concern. As to why they were basically told to wait until the following day before somebody would come out and make entry into Joyce's apartment, I can't really say, but I do think we see more urgency in those kinds of situations now as compared to the 80s. But of course, that's also going to vary from place to place, agency to agency.
How much did the fact that there are multiple jurisdictions involved here play a part in some of that confusion and delay?
I think it was huge. One of the things that we saw happen in episode 3 in particular was that these agencies, even communities next door to one another, the police agencies didn't share information. They didn't talk. And that is a problem, this siloing of information that prevents the officers who respond to, or the dispatchers who take these calls, from piecing together what's actually going on, because they don't have all of the information they need to make really informed decisions. That's something where I think we can specifically talk about this area of Utah today. It's now under a more unified dispatch, but there are places where that's not the case, where one city might have its own dispatch center, the city next door has its own dispatch, and if those two groups aren't talking to one another, if the officers on the ground aren't rubbing shoulders frequently with their neighbors next door and sharing that kind of information, it makes it really easy for those kinds of lapses to happen.
So let's talk about what they found when they finally did go into the apartment and Joyce wasn't there. Two things stood out to me. Number one, why wasn't that washcloth more of a red flag for police?
you find this washcloth, it's dried out, so the police aren't sure at that point how long it's been in position. Obviously, Joyce hasn't been seen since, Saturday night, and it's now Tuesday. Time has passed. That washcloth appears to have blood on it, and in fact, when they send it to the crime lab and have it tested, it is blood. But this predates DNA testing, so all they're able to do is basically look at the blood type and confirm that it's the same type as Joyce, type O. But somebody having blood inside their own place where they live, in and of itself, if you can't tie it to something, doesn't really rise to the level of being evidence enough to say something has happened, right? You could have somebody who cuts themselves shaving or something like that, and a washcloth would be an item you would expect a person to use in that kind of a case to maybe staunch the flow of blood or to clean up a little bit of blood. The washcloth, certainly, I think in the context of everything we know about the case, again, objectively, it's concerning, but in the moment, it's not enough that the police are able to really do anything with it.
The other thing that jumped out at me, particularly after Randy comments about the coffee pot being set like she was going to go to work like normal, is that she would fall asleep to the TV. So we know that the TV was where it was supposed to be, but was it on? Do we know?
From what I understood, the TV was not on. It's interesting because it tells us that whoever it was that went into that apartment, the police at the time are saying, okay, this is not a robbery, right? This is not somebody who broke in and was intending to steal anything, because the items of value, Joyce's property, is all left as it should be. And so the fact that Joyce isn't there, that you have this washcloth that has the blood stain on it, but everything else is neat and tidy, really, again, like the Powell case says, what happened here? Because it's not looking like a, quote unquote, typical crime scene, if that makes any sense.
It does. Talk to me about the decision to go to trial in the rape case. So all of this is going down within just mere days of when the trial was expected to begin. Why was that such a kind of a unique decision to make?
I think this is really the heart of this episode, and part of what makes this story so fascinating to me is that it really broke new ground in Utah, and it's something where the law has even changed in the time since, as far as, can you take a case like this to trial knowing that your victim, your chief witness, is missing? And so the prosecutor, Brian Namba, and the other prosecutors in his office are looking at this case. They all suspect that Doug Lovell is responsible for what's happened to Joyce, but of course, that investigation is happening again in another jurisdiction. They are aware of the discovery of this evidence, potential evidence in Joyce's apartment, but they have to keep that separated from the case that they're trying, which is specifically the sexual assault and kidnapping going back to April of '85. And, when I sat down and talked to Brian Namba, and there's a quote you hear in this episode where he says, if we didn't pursue charges, then Doug Lovell can be a Josh Powell. And that was a situation where I clearly sat up straight and thought, okay, here's a really direct parallel that we can draw. Josh Powell obviously was the lone suspect in Susan Powell's suspected murder, but he was never arrested or charged. And part of that was because the police at the time didn't have the evidence that the prosecutors were telling them they needed to take that case to trial. When we look back at Joyce's situation with Doug Lovell, the prosecutors are saying, okay, we don't have evidence to prosecute Doug Lovell for murder at this point. What we do have is evidence to prosecute him for the rape trial. You could, if you were, as a prosecutor, nervous about that, say delay. You were going to take more time to try to gather more evidence or, work on this case and maybe drop those charges and come back and file them later. But because Joyce had gone and testified at that preliminary hearing and given such strong testimony, they were able to use this exception in the law to present her testimony as hearsay evidence at Doug's trial. And hearing Marilee Gren read it from the stand, we know had a huge impact on that jury. They were able to hear Joyce's words. And so it was a roll of the dice, a gamble for those prosecutors, but one which obviously worked out in their favor.
Do you know of any cases since then where they've used a stand-in for a witness like that?
So using a stand-in is something that it certainly has happened. I've done some research here in the state of Utah. This was not the first case that had been tried in, but it was the first rape case where they had taken it to trial without a victim, as far as we can find in the law here in Utah. But there's been some back and forth on this in the years since, because the role of the preliminary hearing has changed somewhat. If anyone has listened to Talking Cold this week, episodes 3 and 4, there's some discussion about that, how the change in preliminary hearings has actually resulted in more victims not needing to testify. And the lack of the adversarial process, having cross-examination of a witness in the preliminary hearing, makes it, in some cases, so that you can't actually take that and use that testimony at trial. So it's something where we see this teeter-totter of the law, where they push the limits and maybe it tips to one side, and then years go by, another case comes up and it rebalances it another way, and that's just an ongoing process.
To go back just a minute to some of the discussion that the prosecutor and the detective in the case were having as they were considering heading to trial, it sounds a little bit like victim blaming, which I'm sure was not their intent. Talk to me about why you felt like it was important to share that kind of thought process behind the scenes.
Yeah, so there's a portion in the episode where you hear Brian Namba, the prosecutor, and Bill Holthouse, the detective, who are talking about how do they address Joyce in front of this jury. And what they are acknowledging is jurors are people, and they make judgments about witnesses, about defendants, about accusers. And so as somebody who is going to be going into this courtroom and talking about Joyce, and she's not there, the prosecutor, Brian Namba, has to think very carefully about what words does he use, how does he describe her. Part of that is because there is a predominant religious culture in Davis County, Utah, and the majority of the jury pool, the people that might be called upon to serve on this jury, they might have opinions about Joyce, who is not from that predominant culture, about just lifestyle choices, whether she drinks, doesn't drink, going out to establishments socially, as a single woman in her 30s. And Bill Holthouse, the detective, who is like Joyce himself, not from that religious community, is telling the prosecutor, Brian Namba, who is from that religious community, you have to be thoughtful about how you address her because of the judgments that those jurors or potential jurors might make. I felt it was important to include that in the podcast because it is a consideration that often comes into play with these cases. And I think we can reflect back on that ourselves about how we also publicly make similar kinds of judgments about people when we read about them in the news or we hear about these kinds of stories. The questions that you often hear with these kinds of sexual assault cases, what was she wearing? What was she doing out XYZ? It is important not to let those cloud our judgment of the facts of the case that we know, not to let our own inherent biases color the way we see accusers and survivors of sexual assault.
Yeah, and what really stood out to me about that is it felt like that was exactly what Joyce was kind of worried about when she was initially reluctant to report what happened to her.
Right. Yeah. She's worried about not being believed. She's worried about the embarrassment that might come because, look, as a single mother in the mid 1980s in a very conservative culture in Utah, you have to believe that she worried how jurors would receive her, how they would look at her life. And to their credit, I think it's pretty clear that the jury in this case, regardless of any of their individual backgrounds, they placed a great deal of weight on Joyce's words. They did not, as far as I can tell, engage in that kind of judgment behavior. But it is something that the police and the prosecutors did have to consider and think about as they put that case together.
Do you think hearing from Joyce, even by proxy, do you think that's what really secured the conviction there?
You know, I wasn't there in the courtroom, so all I can tell you is the opinions of the people who were, that I was able to talk to. They say 100% that they felt like Marilee Gren's read of Joyce Yost's testimony was the clincher, what really brought it all together. You know, you heard Bill Holthouse say the evidence was good. He's right. They had strong physical evidence. They had a case that they probably could have taken to trial against Doug Lovell even without Joyce's words. But that jury sitting in the box looking across at Doug Lovell, if they don't have Joyce's story, if they don't have her words explaining what happened, and they're weighing that balance of, are you going to send this person to prison? Is there that nugget of reasonable doubt? I think it becomes a much higher hurdle to clear if you don't have Joyce clearly telling you in her own words, this was not consensual, this was an unprovoked attack, and this person should be held accountable for what he did to me.
Yeah. This episode covers a lot of ground that isn't the trial, so let's look at some of that now. You mentioned in the episode a news report about Joyce and her white Chevy Nova when she was first reported missing, and how it had caught the eye of someone who'd seen the car by a water tank in a remote spot. And it just got me thinking, how widely reported was her disappearance? Was this well reported across the region?
That's something that I've really kind of struggled with, trying to figure out how aware were people of this case. We know that the disappearance of Joyce Yost did draw some news coverage. Going back into the KSL TV archives, I've been able to find the stories, but I can tell you the one that is specifically referenced in this case, where they're talking about the attention on her car after the fact. It was really brief. It was, a picture of Joyce and a mention of her car, maybe 15 or 20 seconds on the TV news. There was a little more attention paid, I think, by some of the newspapers in the area, specifically the Ogden Standard-Examiner was following the case a little more closely, but its reach is pretty limited to kind of that area of Ogden and its suburbs, down into Salt Lake City. The two big papers there, the Salt Lake Tribune, the Deseret News, they mentioned it here or there, but not in any great length or depth that I've been able to find. And part of the problem with this is Joyce, as a survivor of this horrific sexual assault, journalistically, reporters oftentimes, most times, if they're doing their jobs ethically, are not going to be identifying people who report these kinds of crimes without their consent. And Joyce obviously not being there to give that consent, the reporters at the time were only able to identify her as a witness in a case. They weren't really able to paint a really accurate picture of what her role is or was in this prosecution against Doug Lovell. And I think that really kept people from understanding the gravity of her disappearance just 10 days before she was supposed to testify.
Yeah, that was actually my next question, was whether anybody besides the police or the prosecutor realized that this missing person was also connected to a crime beyond being missing.
Yeah, I think it was something that kind of went unsaid. And having been in the position of, writing articles or news stories, sometimes you have information that you can't attribute to a source, so you can't necessarily put it out there in the full context of what you know or you think you know. And so you're left to kind of paint a picture that you trust your readers or listeners or viewers are going to be able to see the full circumstance. But it is tough. I don't think, just looking back on it myself, that many people outside of that small circle of police, prosecutors, family members, people who knew Joyce, really understood at that time what was happening in the case.
To go to the discovery of the car, why does it matter that both Randy and Kim remembered making that phone call?
So this is one of the interesting things that happens when you try to dive back into a case that is this old, and especially a story that for these family members, they have told and told again amongst themselves, but also in court. Stories tend to blur. And as I come in and talk to these people about their experiences and ask them questions about what they remember, sometimes you run into this kind of a situation where the information is in conflict. And so I have two people who are both telling me they remember being on the telephone. There's no way for me to specifically verify which one of them it was, or if in fact potentially both of them were. If you think back to the way we used telephones in 1985, you probably had one phone line that went to your house, and you had multiple phones that were all wired to that same line, and you could pick up a receiver in one room and pick up another receiver in another room, and you could potentially both be on the phone at the same time. So I don't know specifically if it was one, the other, or both of them on the phone. What I tried to do was present the fact that their recollection of that moment is essentially the same, with that note that they each remember the one being the one on the phone. And after 35 years, it's entirely possible that they have had a situation where memory has, for lack of a better term, corrupted a little bit. And you hate to call it unreliable, because I don't think it's unreliable, but the details grow fuzzy. If I think back my own life, 35 years, can I remember specifically, what happened on a particular day? It can be really tough to say for sure.
Yeah. What's the deal with the mason jar of paint? Is that going to come back up?
Yeah, so the stuff in Joyce's car, it's interesting because it's unexplained. And what I'm going off of is the written reports of the South Ogden officers who were at the scene when they recovered the car. They did make mention, of the jar that appeared to have this white ooze in it, maybe paint. This will come back up around. It's going to be a minor point in a future episode, and it might not be something that is, how do I say this without spoiling anything? It's a clue, but it could be a red herring clue. So it was important for me to establish that was in the car at this point, because it will be referenced later. But be careful not to put too much weight on it when we get to that point. And I know that makes absolutely no sense without the context around it, but
I will just trust your judgment on that, Dave.
no.
I see that Kim Salazar is actually watching in the Cold Facebook page and pointed out that she and Randy were both present. So that might actually, in fact, answer that question.
Both in the house at the same time. Clearly, from talking to them both, they were together. Yeah.
Yeah, and having used phones in the 80s myself, I can see that. Did police really drive the car themselves? Why on earth didn't they have it towed?
There again, this it's tough because we're going off of the written report. Did they, they drive it down just to the road and then tow it? Did they drive it all the way to the service station? I can't tell you specifically. The reports are, what they say, that they drove it off of the dirt from the water tank there. I think we've seen huge advancements in forensic science in the years that have elapsed since. If this same situation played out today, you have to believe that they would be up there doing photogrammetry, where they would, stick flags in the ground and would mark the location of every piece of evidence before anything was moved. The note that was in here about Kim asking the detectives, hey, was the car seat moved? Interestingly enough, in season 1, there was a brief mention of a related case somewhat to the Susan Powell case, which was the Lori hacking homicide in Salt Lake City, which occurred in the mid-2000s. And that was a case where Lori, this very short woman, was murdered by her husband, Mark Hacking. Mark Hacking had tried to stage her death as a disappearance. He had planted her car at a park where she was known to go jogging. When the police came and recovered that car, one of the first things they noticed was that the car seat was pushed way back because Mark was this, very tall guy. And so sometimes I think it takes thinking about these kinds of situations in a more creative way on the part of an investigator. And if you're a detective in a small agency that hasn't had a homicide case in 10, 15 years, this might not be your specialty, and some of those things can be overlooked, quite frankly.
Is there evidence that potentially was affected by that decision?
Maybe. I don't have a good answer for that specifically. We know that the car was checked over, that the police went ahead and once they got it to the shop, they basically tore into it looking for fingerprints, looking for anything blood related. But of course, this again is a day before we have DNA testing. They don't have the kind of chemical reagents that we see used today, like even in season 1 with the Susan Powell case, where they were, spraying down the couch looking for any kind of blood agents. So I hate to say this, it was a different time, and what they were looking for then versus what they would be looking for now. I think we can make some presumptions about that. Could they have found different evidence now with the tools and knowledge that investigators have? Potentially, but we just don't know.
Why wouldn't the amount of blood that was found on the mattress be enough to prove that a crime had been committed?
Yeah, so this is a really challenging point, because I've talked to people who say that the amount of blood on the mattress was significant. But I've also seen pictures of the mattress and the blood stain, which show, while it's large, it's not so large that I would look at it and go, oh my goodness, somebody clearly bled out here. What I can't tell from a picture is how deep into the material of the mattress that blood had soaked, right? So I try not to make too much of a judgment just based on these photos. Detective Terry Carpenter, who clearly had hands-on experience with that mattress, told me he believed that it was enough blood that someone could have lost consciousness or lost their life there. It's the same problem that we have with the washcloth. You have to be able to tie that to something more specific. And in a situation where you suspect Doug Lovell is responsible for this crime, you have to be able to go confront him with that and have, a person who's not going to invoke their right to remain silent, who is going to potentially, in that situation, give you a confession. What we know is the detectives had already confronted Doug Lovell, and he had told them he had an alibi for the night that Joyce disappeared. He had been at a party with some other people, he had said, and they had gone out and talked to some of these other people, and those people had backed up Lovell's alibi. So to be able to try to confront him with that information at that point, unless you can specifically put him in that apartment at that time, it doesn't get you where you need to be with that evidence. So you can't take it to a judge and say, well, look, here's this blood stain, because the judge is going to say, so what? Connect it. What does it mean? What theory are you proposing here? And you have to do a good enough job as a detective or prosecutor telling that story. They just didn't have that.
Well, speaking about Doug Lovell for just a second, what's with the wildlife resource officer side mission, if you will? I was a little confused about where you were going with that.
Yeah, so this is going to be a big part coming up in episode 5 next week. The question about what was Doug doing during the months between Joyce's disappearance and when he is convicted of the sexual assault and taken into custody in December. So this period from April 85 to December 85. We have a really good idea of what Doug was doing during May and June and even into parts of July, right? We know about the theft of the guns up in Liberty, about his taking those out to the West Desert, burying them behind this cabin, his efforts to try to get Billy Jack to kill Joyce, his efforts to get Tom Peters to kill Joyce, the failings of that, Joyce testifying, Doug having this supposed back injury, going out of work. All of this kind of creates that narrative. But what we don't have is a really good picture of what Doug was doing in the specific period after Joyce's disappearance up to the trial in December. So that period from August to December is something of a question mark. We know that this poaching stop occurred somewhere in that window. The records are not well preserved. And so it becomes really difficult to pin down specifically when that happened. It is going to become extremely relevant in my mind as we move forward through the next few episodes, as you see investigators turn their attention onto Rhonda and come at her with some questions specifically about that poaching situation. So if you can stick with me for, a few more days when we get into episode 5, I think a lot of that is going to clear up.
Can we talk about psychics for just a minute? This is actually something that comes up periodically with respect to both season 1 and season 2. People will frequently ask us why we haven't talked to psychics. Have the police ever talked to psychics? And so I know we're going to get those emails again, and I thought, let's just go ahead and talk about it. What can you tell me about that in this case?
I was quite honestly a little surprised when I went back into the KSL TV archives and I found this story from October of '85 where Detective Brad Birch was saying, we're at a loss, so we are reaching out to these psychics. My whole approach to investigation into reporting is that I have to be able to tie what I am saying back to some piece of factual information. Either I had to be a witness to it myself, I have to have attribution, having talked to somebody who, was witness or party to the events. I have to have some kind of documentary evidence, whether that's a written piece of paper or an audio recording or something like that. Those are the pieces of factual basis that I need to be able to put a story together. Somebody who claims to have a psychic ability or to be able to read people, their approach is going to be different. They are not that based in, quite honestly, just in fact. And I try to be as respectful as possible that other people have different beliefs or might place more weight on those kinds of individuals. But what we see happen, I think, in Joyce's case is that police were at a dead end. They threw a Hail Mary pass and there was nobody there to catch it. The psychics who were brought in ultimately provided nothing to the investigation.
And fair to say that in spite of all of the psychics that had reached out to, say, Susan Powell's family, none of those has ever resulted in any closure for the family.
Right. And I don't want to be in a position of telling anybody that they shouldn't place hope in somebody who provides them with a belief that something good might come out of a really horrible situation. It is challenging for me to see the number of people who have, even in the last couple of years since Cold Season 1 came out, popped up to say, they have done a reading on the Susan Powell case, or they have some, psychic promptings on it. And if I engage with those people and I ask them for more specific information, typically what I hear back is super vague. It's impossible to get specific enough information to act upon, or it's a regurgitation of information that's already known. So somebody who's telling me, information that I could go out and Google and find in an article. And as somebody who knows a lot about that case, oftentimes I can judge very quickly whether or not somebody is being forthright, because they might tell me something that I know is not factual, because I know more than has been published on a case like that. So it just becomes challenging to engage with people in an intellectually honest way when you know there are actors out there who are stepping into that space and in my personal opinion providing information that is not helpful.
We have a question from friend of the show, Debbie Caldwell. Do you know how they found the guns?
I do, and that's going to again come up in the future episodes. The guns become an interesting story within a story because I still don't have full clarity on, again, Doug went and buried those out in the desert. We know they come back later. How did they come out of the ground? Who went and got them? When did they go get them? Some of those questions I don't have the answers to, but what I will try to do over the next couple of episodes is walk you through how the investigation basically tied those guns back to Doug Lovell.
Okay, so one last question that's episode specific, and then we can see if we have any more from the audience. And that's just, there's a lot of people in this episode. There's a Sharon, there's a Cherie, there's a Susan that comes back up. Help me get straight who these folks are and why they're important to the story.
Yeah, this is the same problem that we've had since episode 1. There are a lot of people in this case, and especially knowing that this is spread out over years, and I have to kind of bring people in to the story at the time when it's relevant because of the chronology, but in some cases it won't pay off for a while yet. So, when you're talking about Susan, the teller at the bank who helped Doug get the car, we introduced Susan in actually our very first scene of episode 1. You're now seeing why it was important to set her up then, because she is the person who gives us the insight into what Doug is doing in some of those interactions after Joyce disappears, when he comes in and he's saying, hey, this is all going to be taken care of. I'm not worried about it. Don't worry about the car. If you don't know who she is or what her relationship to Doug Lovell is early on, then that scene here makes no sense. Similarly, we're setting up the Cherie Warren case because of its proximity in space and time, right? Cherie disappearing from the same community, basically. Roy is right up there next to South Ogden and Clearfield in that same area. And only a couple of months after Joyce disappears, suddenly Cherie vanishes. And like Joyce, her car is found abandoned. It's a suspicious circumstance that we will, over the coming episodes, kind of bring some of those ties together to maybe paint a clearer picture as to why that's relevant. We do have the Who is Who section on the Cold website that we've created to help people keep all of these names straight and the relationships. I am actually, as soon as we're done here, going to go update that with the episode 4 names, and hopefully we can help keep all that straight.
Thanks. Got some great questions coming in from our audience now too. This one's from Brandy and Tyler. Do you know if the police ever searched the grounds of Doug's family cabin for Joyce's body?
We will talk about that. I've heard conflicting information about that. What I can tell you, going back and looking at the property records, is Doug Lovell's father, Manan, owned that property from the 1970s up until his death. And so over the course of three decades or so, that was private property owned by the family. And in the absence of a search warrant, which I've never seen that South Ogden Police had a search warrant for that property, you would need consent of the property owner to do any kind of a detailed search. From what I understand, what I've been told, Manan Lovell never provided that kind of consent to law enforcement to go up and search his specific property up in Sunridge Highlands.
This one is from somebody named Eve. What happened in Doug's childhood that elicits empathy for his situation? His parents got a divorce, his brother died, but is there a history of abuse or something bigger that would have contributed to his delinquency?
There's some conflicting information on that point. And part of what I find really interesting contrasting somebody like Doug Lovell to, say, Josh Powell, is we knew quite a bit about Josh Powell's upbringing because of the divorce record for his parents. With Doug, we don't have that kind of insight. We don't have, a really detailed blow by blow in the court filings from his parents' divorce. And so what we have is Doug, in his own words, telling us, hey, I had a great childhood. I lived on the farm. I loved animals, and I liked riding my motorcycle. I liked hunting. I liked the outdoors. He doesn't talk about having problems with his parents, aside from the fact that he didn't want to let them down individually when they split up. He was afraid that they would think he didn't love them. Later on in this story, we'll get to a point where through the court process, there's some testimony elicited from some experts that say, Doug had some head trauma when he was younger, or, his mother was neglectful, or his father was, emotionally abusive. Those are claims that I don't have a good basis in fact there again to be able to establish in this story to say this is definitively what happened. It's kind of secondhand and based on hearsay of other relatives, people like that, who have fed that information to attorneys and whatnot through the course of the case. So Doug's background is a lot more nebulous, and it is I think a pretty big challenge to say what put him in the position to make the decisions that he did, because he clearly was involved in criminal activity from at least the age of 13, if not earlier.
One of the moments in this episode that really stood out to me was, I think it was Bill who was talking, who said he just had this sense that Doug had done this before. Speaking of the attack, is that kind of where we're headed with some of these other names that get brought up in this episode?
Well, we need to be very careful about that. Bill was stating his own personal opinion based on his interactions with Doug Lovell back in 1985. I'm not attempting to construe that there are other people out there who Doug Lovell had done this to. If there were, I would certainly like to hear from them, because that would be relevant information. But one can also understand potentially why, in a hypothetical case, if that were true, knowing what we know now, someone in that position might not want to come forward, right? Bill is somebody who had a lot of experience in interviewing people. He, although he was a relatively new detective at this time, talked a lot about his experience in dealing with people, interviews, and things in episode 2. And so I think you can see where he reaches that opinion. There will be other people who we hear from in coming episodes who will share, I think, some similar points of view. And yes, certainly some of the reason that I'm bringing other names into this story is because there will be some question raised, if not by myself, then by others in the case, about whether or not they believe there might be some connection to Doug Lovell there.
Well, I think that's all the questions we have, Dave. Why don't we talk real quick about how people can find the show if they're not familiar, and then we can call it a wrap here. Tell me about where to find your audio. Where can I listen?
Yep. So we are now 100% on Amazon Music for the main episodes of season 2. I'm seeing some confusion. People who are saying, I see episode 1, I see episode 2. Where are episode 3 and 4? If you are in your regular podcast feed, you are going to have to, at this point, hop over to Amazon Music to listen to the episodes of season 2. Likewise with season 1, the bulk of those episodes have moved exclusively onto Amazon Music. So you can either use the app or go to amazon.com/coldpodcast. For international listeners, Amazon Music podcasts are not available everywhere. So we're hearing from a lot of people in Australia or other parts of the world. Hi, we see you. Thank you for listening. We know that Amazon Music podcasts are not working in your region. So if you are one of those people, hop over to thecoldpodcast.com, use the player that is in each episode's associated article. You can get to it there. I know it's an extra step, but we've made that accommodation for our international listeners. And then Talking Cold, I really hope people are listening to our new companion podcast. I think, Amy Donaldson, Cheryl Worsley, and Dent, they're doing a great job in expanding the conversation about Joyce Yost's experience and the other issues raised in that case. That will remain available anywhere you get your podcasts. So if you haven't yet had a chance to check out Talking Cold, I hope you do.
All right. Thanks so much, Dave. We'll do it again in a week.
You got it. Thanks, Becky.